Hello, everybody, and welcome to this late March session of the VAMP, Vanderbilt Modern Philosophy seminars. We have the pleasure to host today Natalia Strok, who is currently working at three institutions, the Universidad de Buenos Aires, the CONICET, which is the National Research Scientific Fund for Argentina, and La Universidad de La Plata. And Natalia is also, I share with her a participation in the network of the New Voices in the Women in the History of Philosophy. And today, on point, she will share with us a paper entitled Conway and Augustine of Hippo on Sin and Free Will. So without much further ado, please welcome Natalia.
Well, thank you very much for the presentation and for the opportunity for this presentation. It's a paper I've been working a lot. I presented it for the first time in December in a Brazilian Congress. But I have been working it a lot. I hope it's okay. It's a work in progress. Well, I will share now the PowerPoint. You can see it. Okay, well, I start. In late ancient medieval philosophy, the problem of evil is of great importance. For Augustine of Hippo, in particular, it is a subject that challenges him throughout his life and that largely defines his intellectual journey. That is why his approach and permanence in Manichaeism. That is also why his embrace of Christianity. In this paper, I propose to review his interpretation of this problem in his De Libero Arbitrio and put it in dialogue with Anne Conway and her Principia Philosophia Antiquissima et Recentissima. My intention is to show that Conway's position on evil has an Augustinian basis regarding the subjects of sin and the will, which are related to the concepts of order and movement. For that, first I will focus on Augustine, and then I will make a presentation of Conway attending to coincidence that I found between their philosophies. In the Libero Arbitrio, Augustine makes the basis of his reflection on sins and evil by emphasizing that, in his metaphysics, everything is in order according to the design of the good God. Augustine explains, I quote, "So to explain concisely, as far as I can, the notion of eternal law that is stamped on us, it is the law according to which it is just for all things to be completely in order." End of quote. The created world has an eternal law which human beings carry stamped on their souls, according to which everything is in order, because that is precisely the justice that the law expresses. In this just and ordered world, however, there are sins as a form of evil, and therefore it is necessary to ask how this is possible. From the first book of the Libero Arbitrio, Augustine locates the sins in the souls of human beings, which are also created by God, and asks, I quote, "Now we believe that everything that exists comes from the one God, although God is not the author of sins. But this is the sore point. If sins come from the souls that God created, and those souls come from God, how is it that sins are not almost immediately traced back to God?" End of quote. Let us remember that unlike the rest of the created things, human souls have a close relationship with the Creator as image and likeness, that is, because they contain in themselves not a mark or a vestige, but the effective presence of the divinity within them. This means that the human being is the top of the hierarchy of beings proposed by Augustine. For this reason, he embarks on an analysis of the human will to understand the nature of sin, which he defines as, I quote, love of things one can lose, end of quote. The human being, like the rest of creation, is subject to time and is changeable. However, this creature stands out from the others for having a soul that includes intelligence. And for this reason, it is said that the human being is correctly ordered, I quote, when these self-same impulses of the soul are dominated by reason. For it should not be called the right order or even order at all when the better are controlled by the worse, end of quote. And then adds, I quote, when reason or mind or spirit governs irrational mental impulses, a human being is dominated by the very thing whose dominance is prescribed by the law we have found to be eternal, end of quote. The law of that law is the one mentioned at the beginning, in which it was affirmed that justice is precisely order. What is order in a human being is the domain of reason over the rational domain of the soul, because that is the particularity of the human soul. Reason is the highest part of human soul. Animals, for example, do not have intelligence, so they have no obligation to be governed by the rational part, which they lack. Thus, the human being who is not governed by reason resembles the irrational beast. Now, this goal to follow the rational part of the soul is not a simple task. In Book 2 of the Libero Arbitrio, Augustine insists on the mutable nature of creation, which also includes reason. Even more, the human being has free will, so that he can live righteously by his own choice, although requiring divine assistance. Thus he explained, I quote, "For you know that physical objects are changeable. It is clear that the life of which a body is animated is itself changeable through various states, and reason is surely proved to be itself changeable when at one time it strives to reach the truth, and at another it does not, and at one time it reaches truth, and at another it fails." End of quote. The path is not clear, although the end is the happiness that we all seek. The reason for the effort is presented here, and although human soul has all the necessary tools to acquire that happiness, it depends on us to use them correctly. That is what free will is about, and that is why he says, I quote, "To the extent that all people pursue the happy life, then they are not in error. But people are in error to the extent that they stray from the road of life that leads to happiness, even if they profess and protest that they only want to attain happiness. Error means following something that does not lead where we want to reach." End of quote. The human soul has the notion, notitia, of happiness and wisdom that it constantly seeks, because otherwise it will not seek it at all. It is the presence of the divinity in the soul. The problem is the way and the path that is taken to reach it. Whatever the path, a good is always pursued, because there is no evil in the philosophy of Augustine. What is nothing cannot be known, it says, or seek. Evil is not, it is nothing or lack of goodness, So human beings are always seeking for a good. The problem is that true happiness resides in the highest good and not in the other type of lesser goods. The knowledge of what and how to look for happiness was lost after original sin. Augustine, God works to keep things from falling into non-being, and sin comes from that nothingness, that non-being which differentiates the creation of the creator. That is why it is a defective movement, and as such, it does not come from God. For this reason, Augustine says, I quote, "Yes, this defective movement, since it is voluntary, is placed within our power." End of quote. Responsibility for sin does not belong to the creator God, but to the creature that by its own will make a defective movement. For this reason, he maintains in Book 3 of the Liber Arbitrio, I quote, "Since we have no doubt that this movement is blameworthy, we should henceforth completely deny that it is natural. And so it is not similar to the movement by which the stone is naturally moved." End of quote. Augustine traces here the difference between the natural and the voluntary. The trinity of order, weight, and measure, which has all creation, is given in correspondence as memory, intelligence, and will in the human being. Freedom takes place in the expression of this trinity because the will is what generates movement in these creatures. That is the weight, which in the rest of creation is what directs the creature towards its natural place. However, in the human being that no longer works naturally as a consequence of the transgression of original sin. I quote, "My weight is my law. By it I am carried whenever I am carried." End of quote. That is confession. As the will is not fixed but movable, unlike natural weight, it is determined according to love, desire, and can be directed to different goods, also according to the use of intelligence and memory. Thus, human being is in one case will have a virtuous life, and in another will commit sin. However, this is not a defect of the human soul, but rather its peculiar characteristic that places it in a prominent place in the scale of being that our philosopher proposes. This is human freedom, which moves its own soul where it wishes. That is why he says, I quote, "For just as even a wandering horse is better than a stone that does not wander off, because it has no perception or movement of its own, so too a creature that sins through free will is more excellent than one that does not sin, because it does not have free will." End of quote. The human being has this possibility of going against the natural movement. He is freed to his own will. And for this reason, he is superior to the rest of creation. Even when sin is disorder and goes against nature and seems to be troublesome for human beings. So sins are voluntary and deserve reparation. He states, I quote, "Sin and the punishment for sin are not any kind of nature, but rather states of nature, the former voluntary and the latter a penalty. But the voluntary state that occurs in a sin is disgraceful." End of quote. Sins are not natural and neither are they necessary. They are accidents of the movable will of the human soul. That will that is proper to the human being and that places him at the top of the hierarchy of being, is at the same time a punishment due to original sin. Sins, however, have a remedy, the possibility of recovery by the hand of Christ, the incarnate Word. Augustine maintains, I quote, "For the rational creature finds its best nourishment, so to speak, in the world, and the human soul is rational, although it is bound in the chains of mortality as the penalty for its sin, and diminished to the point that it struggles to understand things unseen through conjectures based on things it has seen. The food of the rational creature was made visible not through any change in his own nature, but by dawning our nature to call those who follow visible things back to himself who is invisible." End of quote. Christ became visible as a way to repair and elevate the souls of human beings because they can no longer find their way without divine assistance. Human beings need to search invisible happiness, which seems to be farther than visible things, although its images lives within his soul. Lastly, I want to point out that for Augustine, punishment is, in trust, the loss of the capacity that the human being had to spontaneously want what he owes, that is, his own good, that type of freedom for which he could not sin. Now, with his movable will, his free will, he needs assistance not to sin. That is why the human being becomes ignorant and weak, in need of assistance. I quote, "For there really are two penalties for each sinful soul, ignorance and trouble. Through ignorance, the soul is dishonored by error. Through trouble, it is afflicted with torments. But to approve falsehood and trust so that one errs against one's will, and to not be able to hold oneself back from lustful actions due to the relentless and tortuous affliction of carnal bondage, is not human nature as originally established, but the penalty after being done." End of quote. Augustine in this passage gives the following explanation of error. When we err, we become similar to beasts because we mistakenly seek animalistic goodness and not rational goodness. Living in error also weakens us as we become fearful beings who pursue what is wrong. The rational part of the soul is wrongly governed by the irrational one. Now, despite this, the human soul can recover by the hand of the healing Christ. And that is why the philosopher from Hippo explains, I quote, "These are not mediocre goods that the soul, by its very nature, takes precedence over any material body. That the soul has the ability, with the help of its creator, to cultivate itself, and by religious effort, it can acquire and possess all the virtues through which it may be freed from the torments of trouble and the blindness of ignorance. But if this is so, ignorance and trouble will not be a punishment for sin in newborn souls, but rather a reminder to make progress and the beginning of their perfection." End of quote. These banishments are ultimately medicinal so that the human soul can find itself again and can resume the correct path. Although for that, we always require divine assistance. Now I turn to the topic of sin and willing and Conway. Her work, Principia Philosophia, is the only one we have apart from some letters, and is the result of the publication of a notebook in pencil that the philosopher left after her death. The original text, which was written in English, is now lost. In this text, she presents a Platonic metaphysic according to which there are three types of being that are related by emanative causality and are distinguished by their relationship with movement. These three are the creator God, who is immutable, who creates by emanation the second substance, Christ or medium, who moves only toward the good, from which the third substance is also originated by emanation, that of the creatures that move toward both good and evil. Let us pay attention then to the movement that the creatures have, which can occur in any direction. They are all good, and their tendency is toward good, although they also have the possibility of moving away from good. Evil is nothing more than the absence of good in Conway thought, as in Augustine. There is no substantial evil. The English philosopher affirms, I quote, "Therefore, since the divine power, goodness, and wisdom has created good creatures so that they may continually and infinitely move toward the good through their own mutability, the glory of their attributes shines more and more. And this is the nature of all creatures, namely, that they be in continual motion or operation, which most certainly strives for their further good, just as for the reward and fruit of their own labor, unless they resist that good by a willful transgression and abuse of the impartial will creating in them by God." End of quote. In this quote, Conway explains that the creature's main characteristics are to be good and the power to change. Let us add to this that everything has life in his metaphysics, the main attribute that God communicates to his creation. Now, the good creature can strive to achieve a higher good or mutate in opposition to the natural tendency with which God endowed it, because it has an indifferent will, which allows it to transgress and oppose what is natural. Sin then will not be natural and God's responsibility, but voluntary and proper to the mutable creature, as Augustine also maintains. Conway further offers a definition of sin. It states, I quote, "Thus, sin is ataxia, or a disorderly direction of motion, or the power of moving from its appropriate place or state to another." End of quote. In this definition, the theme of order and disorder is present, and then, as in Augustine, sin is disorder and moving away from the proper place. Like Augustine, Conway denies that God is responsible for sinful movements in creation. While she maintains a monism, all creatures have the same essence, however, they are distinguished by their manner or form. In fact, the difference between body and spirit is only modal and not substantial as well. So she holds, I quote, "If they object that God, who is completely incorporeal and intimately present in all bodies, nevertheless moves whatever bodies he pleases, and that he is the prime mover of all things, yet has nothing impenetrable about him, I answer that this motion by which God moves a body is completely different from the way a soul moves a body." End of quote. God gives movement to the creature, just like being. All essence and movement comes from him. Because God is present in all creatures through Christ, although immovable and in himself, and the movement that he gives to the creature is what we can call natural, unlike the voluntary of rational beings. So, in creation, it is observed a movement that God gives to his creation, but also what is proper to the creature. Hope Sample explains the causal relationship between God and his creation as concurrentism, because there is a conjunction of the creative activity of divinity and the contribution that the creature gives to it. Conway explains about the creation, I quote, "But it is a very different case when the soul moves the body, for the soul is not the author of motion, but merely limits it to this or that particular thing. And the soul itself moves together with the body from place to place. And if the body is imprisoned or bound with chains, the soul cannot depart from the prison or chains." End of quote. We see that what the soul can do is determine the movement that comes from God, that is, give it direction. Unlike the immutable God, the human soul is subject to change and can always continue to improve. Therefore, the definition of sin points to a wrong direction of the movement, and then Conway concludes, I quote, "Indeed, no one thinks that because I say that the motion of every creature comes from God, that he is or could therefore be the author or cause of sin. For although the power to move comes from God, yet sin in no way comes from God, but from the creature which has abused his power and directed it to something other than its truth." End of quote. So it is not God who is responsible for the sins, but the misdirection that the will of the soul gives to the movement that God grants to his creation. Because in her proposal, creation has divine law inscribed in it, just like we saw in Augustine. Conway states, I quote, "For it is most certain that a kind of justice operates not only in human beings and angels, but also in all creatures. Whoever does not see this must be called completely blind. This justice appears as much in the ascent of creature as in the descent, that is, when they change for better or worse. When they become better, this justice bestows a reward and prize for their good deeds. When they become worse, the same justice punishes them with fitting penalties according to the nature and degree of their transgression. The same justice imposes a law for all created and inscribed it in their very natures. Whatever creature breaks this law is punished accordingly, but any creature who observes this law receives the reward of becoming better." End of quote. We see here that justice, which inscribes the law in the hearts, determines rewards and punishment in the form of ascents or descents in the hierarchy of being that the philosopher proposes, that is, transmutations that take place in creation. She holds, I quote, since all creatures are mutable in respect to their natures, the difference between God and creatures, rightly considered, is clearly demonstrated by daily experience." End of quote. These transmutations meet a series of conditions, as the changes do not occur in any way in this scheme. We can determine 5 conditions, which are the following. 1, individuation and identity are ensured. An individual A cannot transmutate into an individual B. 2, the so-called species in this third substance are finally separated from each other. 3, transmutations can be produced thanks to mutual love and vital action that run through the entire third substance. 4, there is a scale of beings and transmutations occur respecting that scale. And 5, moving from one step to another takes time. As we can see, order is important in the ontology of this philosopher. The rewards and punishments are given then as ascent or descent in the scale of being. However, the misdirection of the divine movement is due to the will, as creatures have indifference. Conway maintains that everything can change, and thus a stone can eventually transmutate into a human being. Now, only when it takes on that human form will it be able to twist the natural direction of the movement and thus commit sin. The stone or the horse are not capable of twisting that movement. In the Principia, in Augustine, Christ is the possibility of recovery for sins. Then the correct orientation of the will of indifference will be according to the teaching of Christ, and thus embrace Christianity. Conway says of Christ, I quote, "The purpose of all his suffering up to his death and burial was to heal, preserve, and restore creatures from corruption and death, which come upon them through the fall, and so thereby put an end at last to time and raise creatures beyond time to himself, where he dwells, he who is the same yesterday, today, and forever, without loss, corruption, or death." End of quote. Here we find the theme of the fall, that is, original sin. According to this text, the destruction and death of sin is a consequence of original sin, which results in the fall. That is why divine assistance is necessary, and Christ has the primary role in salvation. The purpose of all suffering and pain is to recover an original state. It is medicinal punishment. I quote, "Thus, in the very nature of things, there are limits to evil, but none to goodness. In the same way, every degree of evil or sin has its own punishment, pain, and chastisement, appropriate to the nature of the deed itself, by means of which evil turns back again to good." End of quote. If a sin or transgression occurs, when one goes against what is good by will, the remedy is an appropriate punishment that will appear in due time. Although there is a descent in the scale of being, and this could be painful, the same pain is a guarantee that evil will gradually transform into good. The penalty, the pain, is its correction, which transforms that nature into more subtle, better, more luminous being. And she continues, I quote, "At this time, every sin will have its own punishment, and every creature will feel pain and chastisement, which will return that creature to the pristine state of goodness in which it was created, and from which it can never fall again, because through its great punishment, it has acquired a greater perfection and strength. Consequently, from that indifference of will which it once had for good or evil, it rises until it only wishes to be good and is incapable of wishing any evil." End of quote. This seems striking at first sight if we think of the mutability of this creative nature. However, here it is expressed that when a sin is punished with pain, one returns to an initial state of goodness and will no longer have the capacity to want evil. The ascent on the ladder makes the descent impossible as long as a sin is purified through pain. Then we can ask about the heaven or paradise to which the third substance tends. The rewards and punishments are produced in the transmutations and not in a different place or area other than the natural world of creation. Following Jonathan Heath, there is no place for eternal torment in her proposal, and heaven can be understood as the continuous ascent of the most suitable spirits always toward goodness in a state of tranquility in the likeness of Christ. The end to which one tends is God, who is in turn unattainable, as long as the three substances are inconvertible into each other. So, as in Augustine, Conway fallen creature seems to have lost the spontaneity not to sin, which is something it can gain from the purification that suffering brings. So here it is worth making a brief reference to the difference between divine freedom and human freedom in Conway's philosophy. To begin with, we follow sample in that Conway describes moral goodness in terms of reason. A good man is, I quote, sorry, I missed the here. To begin with, we follow sample in that Conway describes moral goodness in terms of reason. A good man is, I quote, able to give a suitable explanation for what he does or will do because he understands that true goodness and wisdom requires that he do so, end of quote. That is the domain of reason, as we also saw in Augustine, which is rich in the human form in Conway's approach. Let us remember that the creature has indifference of the will. This is contrary to God, whose freedom is never indifferent, but necessitated by his divine attributes of wisdom and goodness. In Lascano's words, I quote, God is also most free in that his actions are done without external force or compulsion. They are done spontaneously. End of quote. In Conway's words, I quote, for although the will of God is most free, so that whatever he does in regard to his creature is done without any external force or compulsion or without any cause coming from the creature, since he is free and acts spontaneously in whatever he does, nevertheless, that indifference of acting or not acting can in no way be said to be in God. For this would be an imperfection and would make God like his corruptible creatures. End of quote. While creatures can use the intrinsic goodness that God gives them and misdirect it towards evil, they act with indifference. That is, they have the possibility of acting or not in accordance with the best. And this is typical of his changing nature, unlike God, who is immutable. Therefore, although the tendency of the creature is toward God, the maximum it can achieve is the similarity to Christ, which moves only toward good. In that state, it avoids making mistakes and addressing the inferior good in the manner of St. Augustine, and thus it will reach that possibility of desiring only the superior good. Because to wish the inferior for Conway is to sin. Lascano explained, I quote, the choice to love something low on the scale of being rather than God is a sin. It causes us to literally become less than we are. End of quote. Divine assistance in the case of Conway is always available because, in fact, it is the vital action that allows all movement. The process of obtaining grace in Augustine is different, as that God does not give a direction toward good, but sustain beings in existence, preventing them from falling into nothingness. To conclude, although Conway's proposal moves away from Christian orthodoxy in this paper, I wanted to show some topics of her philosophy that will resemble to the thought of the great father of the church, Augustine of Hippo. Both philosophers deny the substantial existence of evil. They both maintain the reign of goodness in their words, as God is good and imparted it in his creation. The order and the correct orientation of the will are key in both philosophical proposals because sin is disorder and seeking for the inferior good. In both cases, creatures strive to achieve happiness. They lack the spontaneity of God, or they have lost it due to original sin. Divine assistance is always at hand, although the difference in their metaphysics distinguish both proposals. Punishments are always medicinal, and the possibility for the creature to acquire a better state, as well as embrace Christ's teachings. Augustine has a huge influence all along the history of philosophy, and his presence may not surprise in the philosophical thinking of this woman of the 17th century. Conway considered herself as a Christian thinker, and she can take these topics although proposing her original thoughts. It will be important to have in mind the main difference between both philosophers concerning the problem of evil. While Augustine postulates a human being that always sins without divine assistance after original sin, Conway is confident that human beings can find their way in her lovely metaphysics. That's all.
Thank you so much, Natalia. I'm going to stop the recording now.